Why is it important to study history?
Specifically speaking about religious rights, I have found evidence of at least 22 other religious riots between 1866 and 1920. You can't help but notice the parallels between what's happened 105 years ago and what's been happening in the last 10 years.
If you were to look at it today, not saying that religious clashes don't happen, and now it's become a hot topic, right? But I mean, if you were to talk about trade unions clashing all over the place, people don't look, people don't care, people don't, as long as it doesn't directly involve them or affect them, people just will not.
You have to be willing to look at uncomfortable histories as well. You know, it's not just about talking about how great we were, all our successes. We have to look at our failures too, because that's the only way we can prevent ourselves from repeating them.
Hello and welcome to the Debrief. I have with me Shamara Wettimuny. Shamara is a historian currently studying at the University of Oxford. And we're very happy to have you here with us, Shamara, today. I'm going to start with how you got into history. When you were in school, did you ever think you would study history to this degree? Did you want to study at all?
Okay, first of all, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. Yes, I did. I loved history. I nerded out with my grandfather back in the day when I was a kid, and we would watch World War II movies and things like that. So I did study history, but I never thought I would be a historian. So that's a sort of later development in life. But I did start.
And were you studious in school, or were you one of those bright kids?
I don't know. I love sports, though. I always played a lot of sports.
Okay.
I think I spent more time playing sports than that. But I think I was also.
Okay. So you never really thought you'd be an academic?
No, I don't think I thought I would be an academic, but I honestly, the truth is I had no idea what I wanted to do, so this probably stressed my parents out a little. I just studied what interested me and what I enjoyed, and then I thought I'd figure it out later.
So what did you do for like your first degree or something?
So I did international relations and history. The history was the sort of passion part. The international relations really interested me because I always enjoyed reading about world affairs and, you know, dramatic events taking place, not that,
wondering what's happening in the world,
basically,
trying to make sense of it.
Exactly, and I think languages always interested me, so for that, international relations was a great stepping stone. I had the opportunity to learn language while studying. We did things like foreign policy analysis, which was really cool. It kind of helped you think about the way you would solve like foreign policy crises if you were in government, and we had these sort of exciting sessions.
At that point, did you ever think, okay, I'm probably heading into foreign service or something like that?
It did definitely occur to me, and it was something I would have been interested in, and that's why I thought languages was also useful. Perhaps I was thinking about exotic foreign postings at one point.
So what languages did you choose or elect?
So in school I started doing German, and then when I was at university I also did Spanish.
Okay, wow.
So you can see the sort of places I was leaning towards.
Dreaming about.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, when you came to masters, what did you, at that time you decided you were interested in what?
Well, so I did my master's straight afterwards and at the same university, so it sort of felt like a 4-year undergrad rather than 2 separate degrees. But it was the history of international relations, so it was more focused on history, but again in the same sort of
By this time you must have felt I'm becoming a bit academic now.
Yes, then I suppose so. And then I had a sort of geographical shift in my interest, because in my undergrad I was doing more sort of the European and American histories, and which was sort of standard for the university I was at. And then I started looking at political Islam and Iran, the state society and diplomacy in Iran, which is a fascinating country.
What sparked the interest?
Honestly, I think at the time I was in undergrad and going into my master's, there was a lot of interesting news coming out from Iran about nuclear discussions. Elections in Iran were getting a lot of headlines. I know that doesn't sound particularly wild and exciting, but it
curiosity.
Was it was this portrayed as a rogue country in the West, whereas in Sri Lanka we think of Iran as also, you know, a place that has deep and interesting cultural roots, fabulous food, beautiful architecture. It was just a sort of enigma to me, and I really, really enjoyed it.
Right. So at which point did it pivot to sort of Sri Lanka, or has it?
Yes, yes, it has. It eventually did. So I suppose I started outwards and then started moving in. It's when I moved back to Sri Lanka after university, I started working at a think tank called Verite Research, and of course that was all Sri Lanka based. And I did a lot of work on religious violence and conflict. And there was this idea that after the ethnic conflict, we were seeing the rise of religious conflict. And I was, you know, asking the question, or there were discussions at that time, oh, this is kind of new, this is a change from the sort of stuff we've seen in the last 30 years. And so I was interested in where actually did this have any longer roots, and then I came across, well, I knew about it vaguely before, but I started really looking into the 1915 riots, as they're called. I'll tell you why I used inverted commas later.
Cool.
So yeah, that's how it sort of shifted in.
So I was actually speaking to another, like a historian some time ago, and something that I didn't know about was basically, I think before the Portuguese and the Dutch and the British, that Colombo was actually had a lot of, it was more Muslim traders.
Yeah, it was a real melting pot. And up until the early 20th century, I was looking at census data recently on the municipality of Colombo. It was so diverse. The list of the different races, as they called it at that time, that were found in Colombo was massive. It was quite great. But it was, I suppose, this sort of melting pot and trading hub at that time, and it continued into the early 20th century. It was extremely diverse.
Do you think Colombo as it is today is similar? Like, does it seem like that, or does it seem changed in any way?
I think over the last 100 years, the population of the Sinhalese has increased.
Right.
It was increasing from the late 19th century onwards, and I think that's probably continued as well.
Change. So you're at the Oxford Centre for Global History right now, studying what exactly? What is your key area of focus?
So I'm looking at the impact of British colonial policies on Sinhala-Buddhist and Muslim-Moor relations. I'm particularly interested in identity formation at that time, because the late 19th century was a period of religious revival across the Buddhist, Hindu and Muslim community. And then 30-40 years later, we have the 1915 anti-Muslim pogrom, as I think it should be called. And so I'm trying to actually trace the history of the relations between these communities further back than has been previously done.
And it's important now because, as we know, we just came out of a lot of, tension between those two communities especially. Yeah. But before we get into that, I just wanted to ask, since you haven't, I know that this isn't your, well, I don't know if I'm just making assumptions here. I'm sure you know enough to talk about this as well.
Probably don't.
But the Catholic Buddhist riots in 1883, that was also an ethnic or religious, let's say. Religious riot. Not even, was it a riot or was it a clash?
It's called, it's known as the Kotahena riots.
Correct.
And actually it wasn't ethnic because it was between Sinhalese Catholics and Sinhala Buddhists.
Oh, right.
So Kotahena in the 1880s was actually a majority Catholic area. And the Catholics, particularly around St. Lucia's Cathedral, saw themselves as the majority community. This space around the cathedral was theirs.
And this is Sinhala Catholics.
Sinhala Catholics. And at that time, there was a temple that was actually going through refurbishment, in a sense, renovation, and they were reopening over the months of March and April, or say February to April 1883. And so the riots took place in the context of a procession, a Buddhist procession that was going past the St. Lucia's Cathedral, where on Easter Sunday, I think it was the 25th of March, when the procession was going past the cathedral, they found that actually hundreds, possibly thousands of Catholics had gathered at the cathedral ready for a fight. And they claimed that There were insults made to Catholics over the past couple of weeks that I think Stanley Tambaya refers to the fact that there might have been a monkey nailed to a cross in a sort of very insulting demonstration against the Catholics. And so these rumors were going around that there were insults to Christianity. And the worshippers outside the St. Lucia's Cathedral attacked the Buddhist Perahera at that time. And the state should have seen it coming. This is for me the most important thing, because this didn't emerge in a vacuum, it didn't come out of nowhere. There had been sort of skirmishes in the days and weeks prior, yet they were woefully underprepared to actually do anything about it, and the police couldn't bring the situation under control, and they had to bring in this the Royal Dublin Fusiliers.
Oh really? I didn't know that, because I also read about some Punjab army that came in as well, right?
So that was in 1915.
Oh, 1915.
But actually, so I was looking into this. It turns out that was nothing unique, because the Indian troops had been brought to Ceylon from as early as 1818, and they'd regularly been used to supplement the white troops based in Ceylon. And for instance, during the Boer War, at the turn of the century, a lot of the European or British troops that were stationed in Ceylon were sent abroad to fight in the war, and they were then supplemented by troops brought in from India.
India, right. So the Dublin troops were with the 1883 riot, and what we know of, and 1915 is when the British...
The Punjabi, there was a Punjabi regiment that was used to kind of suppress.
Okay, so and this 1883 clash between the Sinhala Catholics and the Sinhala Catholics and the Sinhala Buddhists also led to that great debate or something. There was some huge debate, a period of debates between...
So those debates actually preceded 1883. I think you're referring to the Panadura debate.
Yeah.
So that was again between Christians and Buddhists. They started, I think, in the 1860s, but the main one took place in 1873 in Panadura. And it was, on the Buddhist side, you have Venerable Migethuatta Gunananda, who was a sort of up-and-coming, fiery orator at that time. In fact, he was the monk who was also associated with the temple in Kotahena. So that's why
that must be
that's the connection that you're talking about. And it was considered the first time in which really Buddhists almost triumphed over the Christian debaters, because I think they studied Christian documents, the scriptures, and then tried to point out the fallacies or illogical arguments. It was actually a practice. I think Karshana Ramukvala points this out in his book, is that these Buddhist revivalists, as they were known as, borrowed from practices used by Christian missionaries in the previous 50 years to meet them head on and take them on. And in a sense, it signals the beginning of a period of confrontation between Christians and Buddhists.
Right. So to go back to 1883 and the clash between the Catholics and the Buddhists, we also find a lot of the time at that point, even the 1915 riots, the minorities were actually, or I would say the majority, the Sinhalese were actually the ones who were sort of dispossessed or who were at a disadvantage compared to what it is now, because right now it's the majority Sinhalese Buddhists who are very much at the forefront. But back then you find it was am I right here?
So, you're absolutely right in saying that the Buddhists were sort of victimized by the Catholics in the Kotahena riots. But 1915 is very complex in that initially, in the first 9 days of the violence, it was first Buddhists, then just Sinhalese more broadly, because there were Catholics who got involved, and also Tamils who were attacking Indian Moors, and then later on Ceylon Moors as well. So there were two types of Moors at that point. There was a lot of friction between the Sinhala and Indian Moor community over economics as well as religious practices. And the Moors were then the victims of the pogrom. But because of the state's inaction at the beginning and their failure to prevent the violence, they then almost misinterpret the situation. They think it's actually an attack against the British government, and they go into excess, they go into overdrive, and then they start repressing the Sinhalese in particular, including hundreds, thousands of innocents, and then the Punjabis are used as well to brutally kind of repress any sort of rioting, and they go around flogging people, imprisoning people, even executing them out in the fields, but also by courts martial. So it's complex that the Sinhalese were initially the aggressors, and then the broader Sinhala community is then repressed by the state. However, that's the violence that starts on the 29th of May 1915. Now, before that, there were problems between the Indian Moors and the Buddhists, particularly in the context of these religious processions, Peraharas generally. And actually, it was the Indian Moors who were very intolerant of Buddhist practices. So it was not very clear-cut. It was not a case of this X was always a perpetrator and Y was always a victim. There was a lot of push and pull, and these groups found themselves victimized before they became violent.
So if you look back, okay, so the 1915 incident, for anyone who may be watching that is not aware of it, not that I'm the academic here, but I will explain. The 1915 incident was also a clash between, there was a procession involved, and it was in Kandy, if I'm right, and it was a procession of a Buddhist procession outside a mosque.
It went past a mosque, yes.
And there was a clash there. So if you were to look at that incident and also the Catholic riots, were there any other riots like that? You said there were small skirmishes here and there and incidents that happened, right?
So this is the chapter that I'm currently writing right now. So without giving away too much, also because I'm not entirely, I need to work on my work a bit, work on it a little longer. I actually think there were much more riots than we realize. Now, this might also be because the British at that time labeled everything and anything a riot. They never used the word pogrom, for instance. That's something certain historians have done afterwards, including Michael Roberts or other scholars like Qadri Ismail. But they used the word riot to describe what was a fight, say you, me and two other people had, was a riot. But it also includes this thing like what happened in 1915 across 5 of the 9 provinces. So, but specifically speaking about religious riots, I have found evidence of at least 22 other religious riots between 1866 and 1920. So that's all I'll say at the moment, but it didn't come out of nowhere. This was happening for a while, but on a much lower scale.
Right. So are you also looking at any religious riots that happened in the recent past as well, or is your focus of study on during the time of the British particularly?
So for my thesis, it's entirely historical, but
personally,
personally, and of course in my introduction and conclusion, you can't help but notice the parallels between what's happened 105 years ago and what's been happening in the last 10 years. And there are patterns that are emerging, that there is sort of hate speech that precedes actual rioting. What we see on social media today was actually on the front page of newspapers 100 years ago. So the medium has changed.
So I wanted to ask you, without giving away too much from your own work, which we're waiting for, would you be able to sort of identify or highlight a few patterns that you see from all of these riots or clashes between religions as being either something that caused it, or like you said, state inaction that sort of fueled it?
I don't think it's a case of, religious groups being unable to coexist. No, that happened. And Muslims have been on the island since at least the 9th century, and they were perfectly able to coexist. I think the state has a role to play in creating the conditions in which these groups found themselves on a collision course. And of course, as identities undergo changes and groups become more so even nationalistic about their own nation, then you find that they're less willing to compromise on certain things. And they're intolerant of others' beliefs and practices, whether it's the ability to use, you know, tom-toms, hey, we see better when...
I remember there was an issue in that was the 1915 clash,
that's part
right?
Of the issue, so it's to do with, I suppose, the need to just accommodate others and of course, as you mentioned, the state does play a fundamental role. Looking at the historical patterns between 1866 and 1920, it was typically within the state's control to either prevent violence from occurring or to lean back and let it happen.
And so mostly they chose to?
Mostly it didn't concern them, so they let it happen. I'm not saying they want, I'm not saying it was a case of, you know, divide and rule where they encouraged violence. It was sort of not a priority for them. They were more interested in, you know, the economy and making sure the plantations were working, because it was about extraction and exploitation. So if you have these local religious riots taking place and it didn't threaten their rule, they weren't too fussed about it, and they occasionally intervened when they felt it might cause problems that will eventually affect us.
Makes sense. I mean, if you were to look at it today, not saying that it's not saying that religious clashes don't happen, and now it's become a hot topic, right? But I mean, if you were to talk about trade unions clashing all over the place, people don't look, people don't care, people don't, as long as it doesn't directly involve them or affect them, people just will not.
Exactly.
So, okay. So I think one of the bigger questions I have is, like, why is it important to study history? Why should you study history? Okay, let's say that's something that you want to study personally, but why should people have an understanding of their own personal histories, their own, the history of their country? Why is it important?
So I think history gives a lot of understanding about why things happen, and in order to even solve problems in the present or even in the future, it's absolutely vital to know, you know, where we've come from, how things came to be, how relationships between communities, between states. This study of history is absolutely vital for that reason. Now, there are different types of history, there are different approaches to history. So I do something called global history. And in global history, we look at connections through across time and geographies, because there's this idea that we're connected, and you can't understand something without placing it very often in a broader context. So for instance, the state's reaction to the 1915 pogrom cannot be understood without placing it in the context of the First World War, which was taking place in the world at the time. Now, it may not have directly impacted Ceylon because there was no fighting taking place on the ground. But Britain and the colonial state was was in a war mentality. They were thinking about sending troops abroad. They left the country undermanned in a sense. That's why when the riots or the violence broke out, they had to recruit European planters and tea brokers to quell the violence. Now these guys are completely inexperienced. So then it helps us understand why there was so many excesses. There were extrajudicial killings. because there weren't trained people, brought in. These were literally tea brokers from the fort.
And you'll be able to also understand apply the same context to what goes on even today in the country.
Exactly.
Which we can talk about maybe at another interview.
Yes.
So, okay, when you look at Sri Lanka today, what are some of the things that concern you based on what history has taught you? In the sense, what do we not know enough about? What are the things we are in danger of as a result of not knowing enough, and what can be done to practically change it? I'm talking in the abstract. So in the abstract, what do we need to know? Like, do we need to know very practically about just the last 70 years maybe? Do we need to know about just the, the identity, how the nation came to be formed? Like, what are the basic things that you think Sri Lankans need to know?
So I think we don't know enough about the last 70 years, about the post-independence period. We have to look at also, even from 1815, maybe I'm just biased towards, the late 19th century or the 19th and 20th centuries. But now, for instance, if we take 1815 and the Kandyan Convention, that's seen as a very crucial turning point in Buddhist history or Sinhala history, with the Kandyan Convention, the fall of the Kandyan Kingdom. But actually, we also need to see it as the first time, and this is something Harshana Rambukwala says, it's the first time that Sri Lanka is being, in over 1,000 years, being administered as a single territorial unit that brings about substantial differences in administration, in terms of, we start seeing the development of constitutional reforms and representation, that we have to learn, we can learn from mistakes elsewhere as well as mistakes here. You have to be willing to look at uncomfortable histories as well. It's not just about talking about how great we were,
Correct.
all our successes. We have to look at our failures too, because that's the only way we can prevent ourselves from repeating them, at least to the extent.
And you were also talking about, like, we had a conversation once just before, when you said part of your mission is to make history or academics more accessible, and that is also what we want to do. So do you have any ideas in mind at the moment, or is this something that you want to finish your education first and then come back and see how you can do this?
Well, definitely in the future, but for instance, I'm working on an initiative with a group called Minor Matters at the moment, and there we're trying to look at the past 200 years of religious freedom in the island, and we're trying to take, we don't want it to be just books and words and documents, but we want to try and move it away from the traditional space of a museum to try and teach in a more, or communicate these issues and events and stories in a more interactive and interesting way, and in a trilingual manner as well. So language is important, writing or communicating in an accessible way is absolutely necessary to also appeal to different demographics. It's the youth. It's so important to communicate these, the importance of coexistence, the history of our diversity and the plurality of this island at a young age.
And despite all the ills of social media, I suppose that can also be used as a very effective tool for this.
I mean, that's where, particularly in the context of COVID and lockdowns, when you don't have access to physical spaces, whether it's museums or schools, unfortunately a lot of these things will be online, and I think there's then going to be a lot of focus on that in the future as even a pedagogical tool, using the internet or platforms on the internet to communicate these things.
So how long will it take for you to finish your studies?
It's a bad question, but hopefully a year.
And you're just here on a holiday, right?
No. I've been here for a while, meant to be doing archival research. Right. So a lot of my research is based at the National Archives in Colombo and in London. Unfortunately, they're closed right now, but I was able to access them before the last lockdown. And there's a wealth of knowledge in that archive. There's a wealth of resources. And it's run by a fabulous Director General, Dr. Nadira Rupasinghe at the moment. But there are also a lot of issues at the archives. The conservation of a lot of the materials is poor. I look at newspapers that are crumbling in my hands, and I wonder whether I'm going to be the last person to read them, turn them, touch them. A lot of old Sinhala newspapers are preserved on microfilms, but they've started turning to acid. It's called vinegar syndrome, and you can smell it when you try and access these. So I think a lot of work needs to be done in terms of digitization of archives, conservation of archives, and we have huge capacity at home, and I'm sure if we needed, we could get help from outside as well. So I really hope that
Correct. I mean, Sri Lanka is on a huge digitization drive.
Exactly.
And this is a national resource, so I'm pretty sure.
We think about conserving physical spaces, monuments, reconstructing. There's a lot of money put into places like, relatively speaking, at least into Sigiriya and the upkeep.
I thought it was Sigiriya that was going to come.
But sometimes I feel that there's not enough important space, and this is obviously my bias, on documents.
Correct.
They're just as important.
Yeah, I mean, even as journalists, we're taught that it's the document trail, the paper trail that's important, right? So even for you guys, and I think that is a key point you raise, that if digitization has been neglected, especially at a place that's so important like the National Archives, then that is really something that Sri Lanka should look at, especially now that everything is getting digital.
Absolutely.
At this point, I mean, nobody wants to lose those histories, right?
No.
So that will be, I hope that happens. Yeah, and interesting conversation, and I really see this as like a precursor to many other conversations I hope to have with you. I want to talk more in detail about Sri Lanka's history and the issues that are, especially in the context of what will be emerging in the future, so you will be able to sort of balance it out with what you know of the past and what you know of the present. Thank you so much for coming on, and it was really great meeting you in person.
Thank you, Roel. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.